Alpine Liquid Fertilizers is your full-season crop fertility specialist from start to finish. Visit alpinepfl.com for more.
But a crazy week. Prime Minister stepping down. A lot of talk about proroguing Parliament. You've been in Ottawa circles for quite some time. I guess, what is the impact of proroguing Parliament in your eyes?
Yeah, I mean, outside of all the bills that we're watching through Grain Growers of Canada, I think the major impact is Ottawa gets a little quieter. I mean, most members of Parliament and senators are going to go back home to their constituencies, likely going to be doing a lot more community events than they would have otherwise if they were still in Ottawa. But that doesn't mean the work stops, as someone like Megan would know. There's still a lot more work to be done in Ottawa. Political staffers are going to continue being busy, ministers' offices and public servants. So the function of government doesn't stop. Certainly legislation and progress on any type of bills or policies stop, but the work of government certainly doesn't stop, which means, our advocacy on behalf of grain farmers is going to continue up until Parliament returns on March 24th.
Now, with a lot of questions from the audience, and quite frankly, I've been a little bit confused at times because this isn't like an everyday or every year kind of thing where we prorogue Parliament. What happens to private members' bills versus what happens to bills that were in process that the government had brought forward?
I'm so glad you asked that question because it's ultra technical, and I've been doing my reading of all the parliamentary rules this week, so I can brief you on where we're at. But very simply, the House of Commons and the Senate have different rules. So I'll start with the House of Commons. In the House, all government bills have effectively died on the order paper. So any bills that were tabled by a minister of the Crown have died on the order paper, and the only way they can return to the stage that they were at in the House of Commons is pretty much by unanimous consent in the House. And as we know, in the House right now, tough to get anything discussed, let alone unanimous consent. So I don't see that happening in the future. But private members' bills, such as C-234, are treated differently. They actually return to the stage that they were last at in the House of Commons. So they're treated differently than government bills. In the Senate, the rules are a little different. So government bills and private members' bills return to first reading. So a bill like C-282, for example, that was at the reporting stage in the Senate, now goes back to the start of the line, the starting line at the Senate. So it's an interesting time for sure. And one thing I want to highlight is I find this current government has been very allergic to proroguing. I think they've only prorogued once in the last 9 years, which is very rare for a government. I mean, even if you go back to the Harper government, there were more proroguing of Parliament than there was over the last 9 years. So this is, I think, even a unique situation that the government themselves find themselves in.
Okay, Calvin, go ahead.
So it's 282 and these other bills, private members' bills, Kyle, are they effectively, is this a moot point to talk about the technicalities in terms of what we can expect this spring when Parliament does return after March 24th?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, for all extents and purposes, both. What I've been talking about for the week now is we kind of have one win, two losses, and one question mark. The one win is on Bill C-282. Obviously, we've been advocating against that bill because it would have a major impact, detrimental impact on the ability of our trade negotiators to get the best deal possible for Canadian grain farmers, but also Canada's economy at large. That bill going back to first reading in the Senate effectively kills the bill, but it also kills C-234. So interestingly enough, because 234, the last stage that it was passed in the House, was actually at third reading, it will automatically go to the Senate when Parliament returns on March 24th. So it'll actually be at first reading in the Senate as well, and senators there will have to decide how to treat that bill and if they want to expedite it or not. But all of those points are irrelevant, because what we've heard this week, obviously, is the leaders of all the other opposition parties, so Pierre Poilievre, Jagmeet Singh, and Yves-François Blanchet, have all committed, and I take them by their word, but they've all committed that they'll be voting non-confidence on the government when it returns March 24th. And there's three options for them to do that, and one of those is likely to go through. If I was a betting person, I would definitely bet on one of those going through. One is the speech from the throne. The second one is a supply bill, so keeping the government funded. And the third one is there needs to be an opposition day motion. So there's three opportunities for the government to fall. And so I think by March 26th, we'll have the government falling, which means that we'll likely have an election either on May 5th or May 12th. So the whole month of April is going to be an election month. And then bills like C-234 or C-282 are irrelevant because we're in an election leading to a new parliament.
May is a great month, Lindsay.
Yeah, I'm just going to point out, Sean and I both celebrate our birthdays in early May. It's Mother's Day. There's the Kentucky Derby. Why not also have an election? I mean, it's
Why
perfect.
not?
Why not? Yeah.
You forgot about the Indy 500.
I did not forget. I did not. I did not forget, Sean.
Lindsay, question for Kyle.
Well, I want to switch gears a little bit because I think, and thank you for explaining that incredibly well, because I think there has been some misinformation out there about what has happened. I think it is important that we talk about the technicalities of this because rules are important and we will follow them. But I think the reality is that, as you said, we're probably headed to an election very shortly after March 24th. But wanted to talk more, switch gears a little bit to the U.S. Question, of course, to our trade issues. Maybe talk a little bit about news on the dispute resolution with the GMO corn into Mexico. What can you tell us about that file?
Yeah, I mean, number one priority for us right now has become the U.S.-Canada relationship since the election of President Donald Trump and the threats that he's posed to Canada with a 25% tariff. I mean, a 25% tariff on grain and grain products would be devastating to our to the grain sector and grain farmers at large, and it would be doubly devastating because of the uncertainty we already have with our second largest trading partner, namely China. So look, we export over $17 billion worth of grain and grain products every year to the US. It is by far our most important market for barley, wheat, corn, soybeans, pulses, you name the crop. It's number one for all of the above. And any uncertainty in that market is going to have a devastating impact. And we're already seeing that uncertainty right now. I can tell you, I was speaking with a grain farmer a few weeks ago who was working through a program with Quaker Oats and was getting a premium for oats that he was delivering south of the border, actually delivering to North Dakota. And that program's gone already. So he was getting a premium for his oats. That program's gone. A lot of U.S. companies, I think, are already inshoring, which is exactly what President Trump wants from all of his various policies. So that's our number one priority. I can tell you we're working pretty close on it. I had an exclusive breakfast about a month ago with Minister of International Trade Mary Ng, Minister Champagne, and our ambassador to the U.S. Kirsten Hillman, where we discussed how important this relationship is and how the government needs to employ a Team Canada approach. And that's not just the government; that's including opposition parties, that's including provinces, and that's especially including stakeholders like grain farmers in those discussions. So we let them know loud and clear that anytime they go to the U.S. and if they're talking with stakeholders in Iowa or in Washington, D.C. or in California or in Texas, all of those states and almost every state in the U.S. is receiving grain and grain products for one reason or another. The other message we're also delivering is that American consumers rely heavily on U.S. grain. There's a reason they're importing $17 billion worth of grain and grain products. They need it. They need it for consumption. They need it for biofuels. They need it for a variety of different reasons. But we're really talking to the American consumer as well that's at the grocery store every week buying a loaf of bread or buying hot dog buns or buying even canola oil. A lot of that's coming from Canada, and a 25% tariff in effect would be a 25% tax on American consumers. So that's a message we're delivering. And finally, we're working with the Canadian Agri-Food Trade Alliance to plan several missions down to Washington, D.C. to meet with members of Congress, meet with senators, and meet with American officials to deliver exactly those key messages so they understand why grain and grain products from Canada are so important for American consumers.
Megan.
Kyle, what do you think, just bringing kind of these two conversations together, both, the tariff risk that we're facing, but also this prorogued parliament and this lame duck prime minister. He is going to bring premiers to Ottawa next week. What would be your advice to the prime minister, or what do you think that the prime minister and, his current placement within all of this should be doing or should not be doing?
Yeah, it's a great question. And look, I'd probably start off the bat by giving kudos to Premier of Ontario, Premier Doug Ford, for all the work he's been doing over the past week. I mean, he's already been on Fox News. He's been on a variety of different media channels in the US, speaking to American consumers as to why trade with Canada and trade with Ontario is so important for them. So I got to give kudos there. But I think the message that we would deliver to the government is that they need to be active and they need to be present as much as possible over the next 2 months. And that's why I highlighted from the top that despite Parliament not working for the next 2.5 months up until March 24th, the apparatus of government certainly still is. And I'm thankful that Minister of International Trade, Mary Ng, hasn't shown any signals that she's seeking this liberal leadership. So at least we have some continuity in some of that advocacy south of the border. And we've worked with Minister Ng internationally at various forums. We've also worked with her on the U.S.-Canada relationship. So she's a known face south of the border, and we'll continue working with her and her office, while also working with opposition parties so that they're making their stamp south of the border. And I think of someone like Jamil Jabani, who I just heard this morning is likely to be at the inauguration of President Trump. He has a personal relationship with Vice President J.D. Vance. So building those relationships between government, between opposition parties, certainly, you know, if we find ourselves in an election in April, May, things are likely to change if you follow the polls right now. So we need to build those relationships early. And we need to make sure that the incoming U.S. administration understands why grain and grain products are so important to American consumers. And I know there's a similar argument to be made on oil, softwood lumber, steel and aluminum. But I think the difference for our sector and agriculture at large is ours is very much an essential product, right? You cannot live without grain or grain products or any other agricultural product going south of the border. So that's the message we'll be delivering and working very closely with the government over the next 2.5 months, 3 months, 6 months, you name it, maybe years, to deliver that message to our partners south of the border.
Kyle, do you think that our explanation of why the trade relationship is important, so, you know, America needs Canadian products, is that, you know, in 2025 and the mindset that exists, is that not leverage for a lot of people in the US to say, like, why do we need products from this other country? We do need to ensure this and not rely on another country like Canada for some of these things. Now, for cars, you can move a car plant. We've talked about that. Oil out of Alberta is a little bit different story. But when it comes to things that can be moved, is that not giving them leverage? Are we not going to get a bit of a different response this time around? What do you think?
Well, I think for grain and grain products, I think that's kind of that's our strength. I mean, as you said, you can move an auto plant south of the border. You can inshore a lot of different industries into the U.S. What you can't do is increase their landmass. I mean, if President Trump gets his way purchasing Greenland or the Panama Canal, maybe then he is building up his landmass. But I don't think there's a lot of grain farming in Greenland, unfortunately. But all that to say that in the U.S., look, and in Canada, it's the same story. There's not a lot more agricultural prime land that can be developed. Instead, it's actually going the opposite way, where you have major metropolises, be it Chicago, New York City, Los Angeles, anywhere in the U.S., Denver, that are expanding year over year and actually taking up a lot of that prime agricultural land to build condos or houses or shopping malls, whatever it is. So the landmass is actually shrinking to produce grain and grain products, and I think that's why the U.S. imports so much of the wheat or canola or chickpeas or you name it that they need. So I think that's one of our strengths, Sean, is that you can't technically inshore farming into your country. You need these products being imported into the U.S.
Hey, great stuff, Kyle. Really appreciate you joining us here today on this Friday. Oh, Kelvin, do you have? You look like Kelvin has that look on his face. He has a question.
Yeah. Oh, I have lots more questions, but one more I wanted to touch on capital gains changes that took effect last summer, Kyle. We've actually never seen the legislation supporting it introduced, so obviously it hasn't passed. What happens with that going forward as this government potentially falls here at the end of March?
Yeah, I'm really happy you asked that question because there's two policies I wanted to highlight. One was capital gains, the other one's extended interswitching. So I'll start with your question on capital gains. We've been doing the heavy research this week to figure out where do those changes go? Because as you mentioned, legislation still hasn't been introduced, still hasn't been passed in the House of Commons or the Senate. But Finance Canada did come out this week with a clarification note, as did CRA, to let businesses and farmers know that the capital gains tax increase is going to continue being implemented. And there is precedence around this, actually, that once the government gives direction through a Ways and Means motion and direction in general to CRA to start enacting a policy, it will continue doing that until the government or a new government tells it otherwise. So I think we're in this weird period where legislation hasn't been passed, but CRA is going to continue acting on what the government has directed it to do until they're told otherwise. And we have precedent on this where there's previous policies that the CRA has enacted without legislation as well. So this isn't terribly new, but it's not good for grain farmers, and so it's a piece that we're continuing advocating on is against the capital gains tax increase because of how much it's impacting family succession planning. The other piece I mentioned there, Kelvin, is extended interswitching. So the pilot that we're in right now, the 18-month pilot, started in September 2023. Set to expire in March 2023. And the only way to extend that pilot or make it permanent, make extended interswitch permanent, is through a piece of legislation. And with Parliament prorogued until March 24th, we won't see a piece of legislation passed before then. So it's a little unfortunate. That's one of my losses I wanted to talk about is we're taking a step back here with we're going to go back to 30-kilometer interswitching, as you know, which is kind of useless for grain farmers in the grain sector at large. So we'll be stepping back from 160 kilometers to 30 kilometers. But the hope is through an election and with a new government, we can have a permanent extended interswitching that's across the country. So I think it's short-term pain with the hope for long-term gain as it relates to that policy.